Have you ever imagined discovering, after a lifetime with someone, that everything you believed was a well-told lie? That the love, the trust, the shared smiles were tainted by a silent and cruel betrayal? Well, yes. For decades, I believed my marriage was solid, that the ring on my finger truly carried respect and loyalty. I was just a simple woman with a whole soul who believed in the promises she heard. And if you've ever loved this way, perhaps you'll understand what I'm about to reveal. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now might surprise you. This story begins with something as common as it is frightening: my husband's death. After 52 years of marriage, he passed away without warning one gray afternoon, leaving behind a closet full of clothes, an empty chair on the porch, and a diary. An old notebook, hidden deep in a drawer he always claimed was locked because of the bank documents. During the first few days after the funeral, everything seemed like a blur. The hugs, the flowers, the awkward silences. My grandchildren played in the garden, unaware of the weight that rested on my shoulders. I thought the worst was over. That morning was the end of the pain. But there, sitting alone in the living room, I opened that diary, and that's when the real pain began. At first, I thought it was just a silly rant, just random words from someone who liked to write to himself. But as I turned the pages, something started to bother me. He talked about love, about forbidden love, about secret encounters. He used pet names I'd never heard before. And then, her name came. My sister. Yes, you heard that right. My own sister. The one who grew up with me, who was with me every Christmas, birthday, and even at the altar on my wedding day. She was my maid of honor. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had the ground pulled out from under your feet by someone who was supposed to protect you? Have you ever felt the bitter taste of disappointment from someone who always smiled at you sweetly? The diary left no doubt. His words were clear. He loved her. He said that being with her was like being young again, that with me everything was too calm, that with her it was as if time stood still. And me? I stood there, reading all of that with my hands shaking, my heart racing, and the feeling that my entire life had been a poorly rehearsed play. I began to remember things I wish I had forgotten. The looks they exchanged at family parties, her excuses for always coming over. The laughter I thought was just the affection of siblings by marriage. What would you do in my place? Tell everyone? Tear up those pages and pretend you never knew? For a long time, I kept quiet. I kept everything to myself, not out of cowardice, but out of fear of further destroying what was already in ruins. My grandchildren didn't deserve to carry this burden. And my sister, well, she never knew I knew. I never imagined a piece of paper could have such power over a weary soul. But now, after so many years, something in me has changed. I decided to tell this story because I know I'm not alone. I know that other women, other grandmothers like me, have gone through or will go through similar pain. And if opening this wound is the price to pay for healing others, then so be it. But before I continue, let me tell you how this all began to make sense. Because when the past decides to reveal itself, it doesn't come just with written words. It comes with memories, with forgotten feelings, and with a truth that insists on being heard. And it was on a silent afternoon, with the sun slowly setting, that everything began to fall into place. And it was on a silent afternoon, with the sun slowly setting, that everything began to fall into place. I sat on the porch, the diary open in my lap, and the wind seemed to whisper truths I'd rather not hear. Each word written there stirred parts of me I hadn't even known were still alive. It was as if time had turned back, and I was in that room again, watching the two of them smile, as if nothing out of the ordinary were happening, as if I were the only one who didn't know. And it's hard to admit that out loud, you know? Because there are things we feel ashamed of having experienced. There are pains that seem small compared to the greatness of the love we believed in. But today, more than ever, I understand that talking is also a form of healing. That telling this story is giving voice to so many others that have remained hidden inside closets, drawers, and silences. So if this topic resonates with you, if any part of this story touched you deeply, leave it in the comments. Sometimes, it's only by reading what another person has experienced that we realize we're not alone. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on all this. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever kept a secret that seemed bigger than you? Or simply want to leave a hug, a confession? I'll read it with affection. And if you haven't liked this video yet, do so now. It looks like just a button, but it really helps spread this conversation to others who might need to hear this very story. And if you want to continue listening to real stories like this, stories of life, loss, revelations, and new beginnings, subscribe to the channel here. Your participation is what makes this space grow, flourish, and reach other hearts out there, often silent, waiting just for a sign to open up too. You are part of this. But back to that afternoon. As the sky darkened and memories came flooding back, one memory in particular made me stop reading. An old scene, tucked away deep inside, that perhaps explains much more than I wanted to accept. That afternoon, as the diary swayed gently in my hands and the wind seemed to blow the words away, an old memory pierced me like a thin blade. It was a random Sunday, many years ago. We had just finished lunch, rice with roast chicken, the kind he always ordered, and my sister was sitting next to me, laughing loudly, a glass of wine in her hand. I remember looking at them and feeling a strange pang in my chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was something more confusing, as if there was a hidden truth hovering over the room and I couldn't quite put a name to it. But I ignored it, because that's how we're trained to live, right? To ignore it, pretending everything is fine when, in fact, our soul is silently crying out for help. And I was a master at this. A master at smiling on the outside and remaining silent on the inside. Back then, I thought we were living our best time. The house was simple but full of life. There were flowers in the yard, a pot on the stove, and laughter mingled with the smell of freshly baked cake. My sister came over almost every weekend. She said she loved being with us, that she felt at peace here. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. And it's not that we were unhappy, no. At least, not in the classic sense. There were hugs. There were customs, there was a routine. And sometimes all of this can seem like love. It can fool even the most attentive eyes. But today, looking back, I realized that true intimacy had long since disappeared. We slept side by side, but our thoughts no longer met. He was silent, as if guarding a world I couldn't touch. But back then, I didn't have the tools I have today. I didn't know what emotional mindset was. I didn't understand how small, silent decisions could change the course of an entire life. I just followed along, like most people do, like maybe you've done too at some point. There were times when I felt an emptiness I couldn't explain, a subtle unease that made me question if this was all life had to offer. But then he'd come, hug me from behind while I washed the dishes, and that was enough. On the outside, life was on track, but on the inside, I'd been derailing for a long time. I also remember how my sister always made a point of praising him in front of everyone. She told me I was a lucky woman, that there was no man as dedicated as him. And I smiled, because, again, I needed to believe. It was easier to sustain the fantasy than to face the harsh reality. But the truth has a strange power. It can sleep for years inside a drawer, but when it wakes up, it comes with everything. And you can't pretend you didn't see it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because if there's one thing this diary has taught me, it's that behind appearances, there's always a hidden depth that no one sees. We idealize relationships, build castles in the sand, and cling to the promises we heard in our youth. But time reveals. Time always reveals. And when it reveals, we either transform that pain into strength or it swallows us whole. Do you know what struck me most when I reread those pages? It wasn't the passionate words he wrote to her. It was realizing how I'd stopped seeing myself in the mirror, how I'd slowly faded away, becoming just the role of wife, of housewife, of someone who holds everything together while the other one flies. And perhaps this is one of the greatest betrayals, when we betray ourselves first, pretending that everything is fine, that it's normal to feel invisible, that it's just like that as the years go by. But it's not. This process made me rethink a lot. About identity, about presence, about how often we remain silent to maintain a peace that isn't even true. It's a silent, often lonely journey, but one that must be faced. Because only those who go through this darkness understand the value of light when it finally arrives. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know how many of us have been in that nameless place where pain mixes with lucidity and the truth arrives as if without asking permission. He left on a rainy afternoon. The kind of afternoon when you look out the window and feel something different in the air. The sky seemed lower, as if it weighed down on the rooftops, and the sound of drops hitting the glass was the only sound in the house. There was no warning, no drama. It happened quickly, so quickly that there wasn't even time to say those words you always think you'll have time to say later. And it was there, in that wet silence, that everything began to fall apart. Until that moment, I thought the pain of loss was the end of the story. Losing someone you've shared your entire life with is like losing a piece of yourself. You miss them, even when you're quiet, even when you try to distract your mind with mindless tasks. But what I didn't yet know is that, along with his departure, something deeper also disappeared. The false sense of security I'd carried for years. That same day, after the neighbors left, after the phone stopped ringing and the words of comfort fell silent, I sat alone on the edge of my bed and felt a different kind of loneliness. It wasn't just his absence. It was as if I were suddenly being forced to face a new world, an inner space I'd never visited, a place where memories and lies coexisted silently, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was in this climate of confusion and exhaustion that days later I found the diary. Hidden behind a stack of old folders, inside that drawer, he always said was too messy to touch. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just trying to organize my life, like someone trying to fold sheets that no longer have a pair. But when I picked up that dark-covered notebook, I felt something inside me hold my breath. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the kitchen table, staring at it like someone staring at a bomb about to explode. I knew, in a way I can't explain, that the diary wasn't just a bunch of pages. It was a portal, a direct access to the backstage of a story I thought I knew so well. When I finally opened it the next night, what I found there took my breath away. It wasn't just the shock of the words, but the impact of realizing that my intuition had never been wrong. For years, I'd had premonitions, slight nagging, small suspicions that I chose to silence in the name of peace. But peace, I now know, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the true presence. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the grief I experienced wasn't just the loss of a person. It was also the end of an illusion. And no one prepares us for that. They talk about the suffering of death, the stages of grief, the phases of acceptance. But no one talks about the pain of discovering that, even in goodbye, there are still hidden truths, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I read every line of that diary with trembling hands and a heavy heart. He wrote passionately, like someone living a parallel life they don't have the courage to face head-on. He said he felt alive with her, that with her, the days had color. And I, who thought we had built something solid, realized I was living in a different storyline than he was. It's a feeling hard to explain, as if you'd been a supporting character in your own story, as if someone had rewritten your past from the margins without you realizing it. It shook my identity, my sense of worth, my ability to trust what I see. But the hardest part was understanding how it happened before my eyes, because she, my sister, was a constant presence in our home. She knew our habits, our pains, our daily lives, and at the same time, she carried within her a secret that now seems glaring in every old gesture I remember so clearly. Our minds are curious, aren't they? They protect, erase, distort, until something breaks this mechanism and everything comes flooding back. The diary was that break. It was what forced me to face the hidden truth that had always been there, disguised as routine. And while the outside world continued as normal, I was experiencing an internal transformation that no one saw. Because there's no manual for this kind of pain. There's no map that teaches you how to navigate a journey in which the person who hurt you is no longer here to respond. That's why telling this story isn't just about venting. It's about rebuilding. It's about trying to understand myself, to make sense of the pieces that remain, and to transform scars into learning experiences. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. I want to know who else is rediscovering themselves in the midst of what seemed like just the end. I can still remember the exact texture of that diary's cover. It was dark, almost black, with signs of age in the corners, as if it had been hidden there for years, waiting for the right moment to be found. It had no name, no date, just the invisible weight of something that shouldn't be there. I found it by chance, cleaning out his closet, folding the clothes he always wore the same way, The plain t-shirts, the wool coats on cold days, and that plaid shirt he wore to Sunday lunches. At first I thought it was a notebook or maybe some old list. He'd always been organized with things like that. But as I flipped through the first few pages, I realized this was different. Very different. The smell of the aged paper mingled with the fright I began to feel as the words began to take shape. It was him. It was his handwriting, and the sentences he wrote weren't for me. The sensation was like being pulled back in time, as if I were reviewing my own life through a crack I'd never seen before. And with each page turned, a new piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. Only it wasn't the kind of fit that brings peace. It was the kind of fit that unravels everything. He spoke of her, of my sister, with a naturalness that cut like a knife. He described the encounters, the feelings, the secrets. He used sweet, even poetic words. He said that there, with her, he was his true self, that he felt light, alive, as if time had stopped. And there I was, reading, sitting in the kitchen chair where I'd so often served coffee for the three of us, remembering family lunches, birthdays, Christmases, when she'd bring the same wine and say it had a sophisticated taste. It was all true, just not in the way I'd imagined. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's something crueler than a lie. The silence shared between two people who know the truth and yet look into each other's eyes as if nothing were happening. And the strangest thing is that on some level, my body always knew. That butterflies in the stomach feeling I'd get when I saw them talking to themselves. The way she offered to help with everything, even when I didn't need it. But I didn't want to see. Because seeing means change. And change, at that point in my life, seemed too risky. So, like many people do, I clung to the version of reality that kept me going. I chose to believe in stability. But stability built on lies is like a paper wall. All it takes is a strong breeze to bring it all down. The diary was that breeze. Or perhaps, more honestly, it was a storm. He left behind a testament of hidden truths, written in detail, as if he wanted someone to one day find them. I don't know if it was guilt. I don't know if it was a need to record, but it was all there. And what strikes me most to this day is the coldness of his words. There was no regret. There was no doubt. It was as if he lived a parallel life and enjoyed it. Reading that took me from a comfortable place, but it also pushed me to a point in my journey where I finally needed to see myself with new eyes. The woman I'd been for so many years, dedicated, loving, resilient, hadn't disappeared, but she was exhausted, tired of carrying everything alone, including the illusion that everything was okay. This experience taught me that there are decisions we don't make consciously, but that shape us anyway, like allowing the other person to be a priority, as if our own voice were secondary, like accepting emotional scraps, thinking this is normal in a long-term marriage. This kind of discovery, intimate, painful, solitary, transforms anyone's mindset. Because you begin to realize how many versions of yourself were left behind in the name of coexistence, harmony, and family. And that, my dear, is not love. Love is reciprocal choice, real presence, truth. Sometimes the hardest revelation is precisely the one that sets us free. Because after it, there's no more pretending, no more putting on the same mask and smiling in the same photos as before. The impact of the truth can be cruel, but it's also a beginning. The beginning of an internal fresh start, even if silent, even if no one around you notices. Write it down. I've already felt this on my skin. I want to know how many of us have stared at a closed notebook, literal or metaphorical, and discovered within it a world we never imagined existed. At first, it felt like poetry, words written carefully, like someone who feels too much and needs to get it out. He spoke of glances that soothed, of hidden touches, of brief moments that seemed eternal. He spoke of a love that made him feel alive. And there, for a few moments, I allowed myself to believe those words were for me, that even after so many years, he still wrote like this, about us. But it only took 2 or 3 more pages for everything to fall apart, because he wrote her name. And when he wrote it sweetly, like someone protecting something precious. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't ambiguous. It was clear, direct, and absolutely real. And that's when my body froze, because I understood, without a shadow of a doubt, that the love he described was never mine. It's hard to explain the feeling. You feel like you've lost something, but you're not sure what. It's not just trust. It's as if the very foundation that held every memory has been ripped away. Part of you wants to tear up the diary and pretend you never saw it. The other wants to reread everything, line by line, to be sure, to avoid thinking you've gone mad. Because deep down, betrayal shakes our sanity. It whispers that maybe you were too blind, too stupid, too weak, and you start to rethink your entire trajectory. I found myself doing this, mentally replaying moments that once seemed innocent, but now carried a new weight. The birthday party where she laughed too hard at his jokes. The time she insisted on going alone with him to buy a gift for my grandson. The whispered conversations I ignored out of habit, out of blind trust. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's a layer to betrayal that few people talk about. How much it affects our perception of self-worth. When you've dedicated yourself to someone for a lifetime and discover they used the same sweet words that fed you, but with a different one, it tears you apart inside. It's not just jealousy. It's the feeling of having been invisible, even though you were there all along. And I began to wonder, at what point did he stop seeing me? Or did he never really see me at all? Was I just a convenient foil? The functional partner? The one who held the fort while he lived out another plot behind the scenes? These questions slowly ate away at me. And the most painful part was that they no longer had answers. He was no longer there to explain himself. There was no more confrontation, shouting, or demanding. It was just me, the diary, and the echo of what was never said out loud. But even so, even through all the pain, I kept reading, because somehow I needed to understand. I needed to face that hidden truth head-on, even if it hurt, because pretending I didn't see it would be a second betrayal. This time, one committed by myself. His words had a strange sensitivity. There was beauty there, yes, but it was a tainted beauty, like a flower growing in contaminated soil. He spoke of freedom, of connection, of desire, feelings I'd forgotten he could even have. And that was what shocked me most, discovering he was still capable of feeling all those things, just not for me. We get so used to the routine, to the role of companion, of support, that we forget we also have the right to romance, to the enchanted look, to the touch that sends shivers down your spine. And when you realize that this part has been diverted, given to someone else, it's as if you've lost something you didn't even know you could still desire. But amidst all this, something inside me began to stir, an old, dormant part, as if the pain had dusted off a long-forgotten version of me. A woman who wanted more than to be useful, who wanted to be seen, felt, loved with presence. This revelation forced me out of emotional autopilot. It pushed me to a place where I could no longer accept less than I deserved. And even though I didn't yet know what to do with all of that, I understood that I could no longer be a spectator to my own story. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know who else has looked in the mirror and realized they were living by inertia, accepting crumbs without realizing they deserved the whole feast. When I read her name, my heart froze. It was as if the ground had dropped out from under my feet, as if time had stopped just to force me to face it with all the clarity in the world. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for softening. It was written there, in bold letters, my sister's name, the same one who grew up with me, who shared toys, teenage secrets, clothes, fears, and promises. At that moment, my body trembled, not from anger, but from a kind of paralyzing disbelief. You know that kind of pain that takes a while for your brain to register? The kind that hits so hard you only feel it after a few seconds? It was like that, a cruel delay between what your eyes saw and what your heart refused to accept. They had a history, a parallel history, hidden but very much alive. It was more than a slip, more than impulse. It was affection. It was choice. The way he spoke of it made that clear. There was no confession there. There was celebration. And that was perhaps the hardest part, realizing that he wasn't writing as someone who regrets, but as someone who relives. And my sister, she was always so close, always present, always involved. For years, I thought that was affection, care, a bond. But now, rereading every moment through the lens of hidden truth, everything changed. Those quick glances between them, the smiles exchanged when they thought no one was paying attention, the hugs that lasted a second too long. I saw it all with new eyes, and I felt as if I were watching my own life, but from the outside, as if I'd been an extra in the most important story of my existence. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when betrayal comes from outside, we defend ourselves, but when it comes from within, from our own family, it's like being stabbed with a borrowed knife. It's a cut that spans generations, challenging everything you believed about loyalty, brotherly love, and trust. I saw myself there, standing in the kitchen, clutching that diary like a bomb, and I wondered how she could have done it. How, after everything we'd been through together, after everything we'd faced side by side, she could have crossed that line, not as a stranger, but as someone who knew exactly what was breaking. The disappointment wasn't just with him, it was with her, and perhaps even more with myself, for never having realized it, or for having realized it and pretended not to. Because the truth is, if I'm being completely honest, there were times when my body spoke, when my intuition screamed softly inside me, but I stifled it because I thought distrusting someone you love was ugly. But now, with everything out in the open, I understand. What's really ugly is pretending that everything is fine while your soul rots inside. And that's where transformation comes in, because pain forced me to look at myself differently. It made me revisit the decisions I made, the limits I never imposed, the times I kept quiet to avoid conflict. I realized that, unintentionally, I was erasing myself. I was ceasing to exist in the name of other people's peace. I thought that was what love was, giving in, understanding, always forgiving. But love can't be a one-way street. It can't be a place where only one protects themselves while the other exposes themselves. And in that moment, reading that name on the paper, I understood that I had been sacrificing myself for something that had been broken for a long time. And yet, even with all this weight, what tore me apart most was the silence. Because she kept coming here. She kept hugging me, looking into my eyes, bringing gifts for my grandchildren. She kept calling me sister. This kind of pain doesn't scream. It whispers. It settles slowly in the details. In the memories that become distorted, in the old photos that now hurt, in the words you wish you'd never heard. Write it down. It broke something in me. I want to understand if, at some point in your story, you also felt betrayed by the person who swore to protect you the most. It's curious how our minds have this strange way of protecting our hearts. We see, hear, feel, but we don't want to truly see, and so we push it away, pretending we didn't see, justifying every detail. Because deep down, there's this desperate desire to preserve what we love, even if its structure has long been crumbling. After I read her name in the diary, it was as if someone had turned on a light inside my memory, a cold, direct light that began to illuminate things that had been hidden in corners for years. I remembered the whispered conversations between them, the way she'd hide her laughter whenever he'd said something silly, the looks. Oh, the looks. I saw them. Of course I did. But I convinced myself it was all in my head, and that's the most treacherous thing when we doubt our own intuition, when the inner voice screams, but we stifle it because we fear what we'll find if we listen. I told myself it was just affinity, that they'd become close because he was a good brother-in-law and she a present sister. But the truth was there, seeping between the lines, and I refused to decipher it. Now everything made sense. Her visits at random times, the gifts she brought more for him than for me, the advice she gave as if she knew too much about my marriage, the way she looked at me sometimes as if I were carrying a burden. I used to mistake that look for empathy, but now I understand it was disguised guilt, and that wasn't all. Other memories began to surface, fragments I'd overlooked, him hiding his phone, changing the subject when I entered the room, saying he was going for a walk alone. Small things, but now they carried a new weight. They weren't coincidences, they were decisions. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's a huge difference between living in the dark and choosing to remain there. And for a long time, I chose to. Not because I was stupid or weak, but because I thought true love required sacrifice. That's how I was raised. The generation before mine taught us to keep the family together at all costs, to ignore discomfort, to maintain peace. But peace built on lies isn't peace. It's anesthesia. And that's where the real impact of this discovery lies. It forces you to rethink your own mindset, to rethink everything you've tolerated, everything you've swallowed, everything you've failed to confront in the name of something that may never have been as real as you believed. Realizing this was like falling into myself, a silent, solitary dive, where each memory gained a new layer. And there, in this internal reconstruction, I began to understand that this wasn't just a betrayal between two people. It was a shattering of the entire belief system I'd spent a lifetime building. I believed in the sacredness of family. I believed that blood ties were unbreakable, that a sister was synonymous with refuge, care, and complicity. And when that pillar crumbled, I found myself floating in a strange void between the love that still existed and the trust that would never return. It's funny how, even in the face of so much pain, we still try to justify it. I found myself trying to remember times when I might have stopped being enough. I started wondering if I was cold, if I stopped looking, if I stopped listening. But this is also part of the cycle of pain, taking on blame that isn't yours, trying to regain control of what has already slipped out of your hands. But, with time, and I say this with the calm of someone who has cried through the night, we begin to understand that not everything is about merit, that someone else's choices say more about them than about us, and that certain revelations come not to destroy, but to liberate. It hurts, of course it hurts, but there's a certain clarity that comes from this pain, a kind of clear vision that only comes after the shock. And when it arrives, it's as if you finally see yourself not as a victim, but as someone who can now choose again, with awareness, with strength, with your whole soul. Write it down. Now I see things differently. I want to know who has also gone through this kind of revelation that changes everything, even the way we see ourselves in the mirror. I decided not to tell. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I swallowed it all, alone. Not out of pride or cowardice, but because at that moment I was too tired to start a war that I wouldn't win. I looked at her, my sister, with the same expression as always. And perhaps that was the most painful thing of all, continuing to represent a normality that no longer existed. She never knew I knew, and I made a point of keeping it that way. I spent days, weeks, even months wearing the same mask as always, laughing at the same jokes, listening to the same advice, accepting the same hug that once brought me comfort, but now left only a bitter taste. It was like watching a play where every line was wrong, but I couldn't get up from my seat. And it was there that I began to understand the weight of silent decisions. Because sometimes doing nothing is a choice with profound consequences. I chose not to expose myself, to not break the family structure. My grandchildren still had an image of her as a reference, and I didn't want to take that away from them. I didn't want to become the epicenter of a storm. But what no one saw was that, while he maintained calm on the outside, inside, everything was falling apart. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's a kind of pain that doesn't explode. It doesn't scream. It doesn't tear at the chest. It settles in slowly, like a mild poison, slowly contaminating every gesture, every memory, every space that was once sacred. The silence I chose was armor, but this armor also weighed me down. It trapped me. I began to observe the behind the scenes of everything with new eyes. Her words, once so familiar, now seemed measured. The way she looked at me carried a softness that had previously warmed me. But now I only saw distance, as if she, unknowingly, sensed something had changed. And it's strange, because even without confrontation, the dynamic changes, the energy shifts. I stopped trusting. I could no longer share my joys or my fears. What once was sharing became a disguise, and the feeling of being alone, even surrounded by people, became a constant. The hidden truth had created an abyss, and I had to relearn how to walk close to the edges without falling. During this silent process, a lot began to reorganize within me. I realized that the silence that once served to protect others now needed to protect me from myself, because holding a grudge, we know, is like taking poison and hoping the other person will get sick. And I didn't want to become that kind of bitter woman who carries too much weight in her eyes. So I began, little by little, to rebuild myself, still without speaking, still without confrontation, but with a new mindset, one that set boundaries even without words. That understood the value of emotional distance, that learned to say no without raising my voice. I stopped allowing certain intimacies. I declined invitations disguised as affection. I changed the tone of conversations, and most importantly, I stopped expecting something that would never come, because maybe she would never regret it. Maybe he would never know the impact of what he did, and that's okay. Some pains we don't need to return, only transform. This was, without a doubt, one of the hardest parts of the journey. Staying silent when everything inside me screamed, swallowing the tears when they rose dryly in my throat, sitting at the family table, looking at her, and pretending this story was just mine. But it was also in this silence that I discovered a strength I didn't even know I had. A strength made of presence, of firmness, of determination. Because sometimes standing in the face of pain is braver than going after it. And that's what I chose, standing. Not for her, not for him, for me. Comment here. I also held it alone. I want to know who has had to maintain the balance of the world even when their own heart was crumbling inside. The grief turned into heaviness. The heaviness turned into silence. And the silence almost killed me. Not literally, but in a more subtle, more dangerous way. Little by little, I stopped smiling lightly, sleeping peacefully, taking pleasure in the little things. Everything seemed grayer, slower, as if I were dragging an invisible burden with every step. People still saw me the same way, strong, stable, serene, but something inside me was crumbling day after day. When pain has nowhere to escape, it lodges itself, in the body, in the skin, in the bones. I began to experience bouts of fatigue that wouldn't go away with rest, an emotional fatigue that consumed me. My hands would tremble silently when I tried to hold a cup. Sometimes I'd forget what I was going to say mid-sentence, as if my mind refused to cooperate with the weight of what I was holding inside. And no one saw, no one asked, and I didn't tell either. Because how do you explain a pain you've chosen not to reveal? How do you describe a grief that isn't just about someone's death, but about the death of everything that person represented? There was one day in particular that really struck me. It was late afternoon, the sky was a bit cloudy, and I was alone in the kitchen. I'd left the kettle on, but I didn't realize it was already boiling. The sound of the whistle startled me, and there, in that ordinary scene, my body froze. I was paralyzed for seconds, and I cried. I cried with silent desperation, like someone opening a dam after months of holding it in. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was the accumulated weight of omission. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what no one talks about is that emotional pain also has physical symptoms. Grief, when left untreated, becomes an illness. It turns into chronic discouragement, chest pains, memory lapses, insomnia. It turns into a distancing from yourself. You look in the mirror and no longer recognize yourself. The woman who once made plans, who enjoyed taking care of the house, who laughed at her own jokes, that woman begins to disappear. I got sick inside. And the cruelest thing is that I continued to function on the outside, making lunch, doing laundry, going to the grocery store. Obligations kept me going. But I knew what sustained all of this was fragile, unstable. And what held me together, often, was the simple feeling that I still needed to be there, for my grandchildren, for the few bonds I had left. But this presence we maintain for others, if not sustained by internal care, eventually begins to take its toll. I began to realize this when I no longer felt pleasure in anything, not even the smell of coffee, which always gave me that feeling of home, not the sunny mornings, not the conversations with neighbors that once made me laugh easily. Everything became dull. It was then that the penny dropped. Either I faced it head on, or I was going to disappear forever. And I'm not talking about external confrontation. It wasn't about confronting my sister or making a fuss. It was about looking at myself with courage, about getting out of survival mode and trying to live again. That's when I slowly began to ask myself, what do I want to preserve within myself? What parts of me still deserve care? I sought help. First, silently, with books, with the words of other women who also carried invisible pain. Then, more openly, talking to people I trusted, venting without guilt. And over time, I understood that just talking is medicine, that acknowledging the pain is the first step to healing. It was a process, a journey really, A path full of detours, setbacks, days when I wanted to return to the hiding place of silence, but also of small victories, like when I managed to sleep through the night without waking up startled, or when I found myself smiling to myself as I recalled a good memory that no longer hurt. This phase of my life taught me that we become sick on the outside when we disrespect what we feel on the inside, that the body holds what the soul tries to hide, and that yes, it is possible to transform this pain into a turning point. Write it down. I've felt that weight. I want to know who also carried inside a pain that no one saw, but that consumed everything in silence. It was when I decided to write everything down that things began to change, not from the outside in, but from the inside out, from that deep place where we keep what we can't name. At first, I wrote in fragments, loose sentences, memories that came in waves, scribbles that barely made sense. But each word I put on paper seemed to pull at a knot in my chest, as if the pain was finally finding its way out. For a long time, I couldn't speak, because speaking is more than just saying words. It's allowing yourself to be seen. And for someone who's spent their entire life caring for others, carrying everything without showing weakness, admitting their own pain seems dangerous. It feels like it will dismantle everything you've built. But curiously, it's the opposite. Speaking freed me, first on paper, then quietly, to myself, in the wee hours of the morning, when the silence of the house seemed to hear better than anyone else. And later, in frank conversations with people who knew how to listen without judgment. It was in this process that I realized how much I had hidden, how much I had lived to maintain an image of strength, of control, of stability, while inside, the woman I was lost. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's something powerful in choosing to reveal yourself. When we tell our own story truthfully, without embellishment, without trying to appear stronger than we are, something changes. The wound doesn't disappear, but it stops bleeding. It heals in the form of awareness. You stop being a prisoner of what you hide. And that's what happened to me. As I wrote, I listened to myself. And the more I listened, the more I understood that that story, however painful it was, didn't define me. It was part of me, yes, but it wasn't the end of my narrative. It was a turning point, a transformation. I began to remember the woman I was before all this, the curious girl, the young woman who dreamed, the wife who once truly loved and believed sincerely. I rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant. And little by little, I realized I no longer needed to carry silence as a shield. Speaking out didn't mean exposing anyone. Speaking out was about respecting myself, about giving voice to my truth, about allowing my pain to not be invisible, because invisibility makes you sick. And I had already paid that price too dearly. I discovered in this process that many other women also carry hidden wounds, silenced stories, unprocessed traumas, decisions that were swallowed as if they didn't matter. And when I realized this, I felt that keeping this story to myself would be unfair. So here I am, telling you not to accuse, not to seek compassion, but because I believe that shared truth has the power to heal not only the speaker, but the listener. Life has taught me that speaking from the heart is an act of courage. It's taking pain out of the shadows and placing it in the light. And it's precisely in the light that we understand there is life after a breakup, after loss, after betrayal. There is a new identity that emerges after the chaos, and this identity, when built from one's own truth, has a power that no one can take away. Today, I'm no longer that woman who kept quiet to protect the world from others. I'm still careful, kind, but now I know my limits. I know when something hurts me. I know when a word gets through to me. And more than that, I know I have the right to speak my mind. This inner freedom didn't come from outside. It didn't come from an apology, nor from outside recognition. It was born from the moment I stopped lying to myself. When I looked in the mirror and, even with everything that had happened, I was able to say, I deserve to hear myself. So, if there's one thing I can leave on record here, it's this. The beginning of healing isn't in making the other person change. It's in stopping silencing yourself. Write it down. Today, I listen to myself. I want to know if you've reached that point too. The point where, even without external answers, you decided to give yourself the chance to start over from within. The truth doesn't always arrive when we'd like it to. It doesn't knock on the door with flowers. It doesn't gently warn us. nor does it care about our emotional preparedness. Sometimes it arrives too late, after death, after pain, after surrender. But even so, it arrives. And when it arrives, no matter how much it hurts, it has the power to reorder everything within us. His diary hurt me, not just because of the words, but because of what they revealed about me. Because it wasn't just the betrayal that came to light, it was also the woman I had become trying to keep everything together. The woman who suppressed small annoyances, who justified absences, who smiled even when her chest screamed inside. And suddenly, there were all these versions of me, scattered between the lines of that old notebook. Strange as it may seem, the truth I found there also woke me up. It woke me from passivity, from conformity, from the feeling that my story was already defined. It woke me up to something greater, the awareness that life still belongs to me, even after so much loss. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there's something we urgently need to understand. Not every new beginning begins externally. You don't always need a new setting, a new love, a new city. Sometimes, the true new beginning is internal. It begins with a change of mindset, with the simple and at the same time revolutionary act of allowing yourself to feel, name, process, and move on. I had to wade through a lot of shadows to get to this point. There was anger, yes. There was sadness, resentment, shame. But I didn't let myself stagnate in any of these phases. I passed through each one, as if walking down a dark corridor, feeling the walls, knowing that at some point the light would return. And it did. Slowly, like dawn on a cloudy day. But it did return. I discovered, in this process, that pain doesn't have to be the villain. Sometimes it's just the messenger. It points out where we stopped listening to ourselves, where we stopped existing for fear of losing the other. And that's not weakness. That's human. But it's also an invitation to transformation. I've learned that forgiveness, in this kind of story, is something much more intimate than we imagine. It's not about forgetting, nor about justifying. It's about stopping carrying what no longer belongs to you. It's about clearing your inner space, letting go of what weighs you down, making room for a new kind of peace, a good silence, one that doesn't suffocate, that doesn't hide, a light silence of someone who no longer needs to pretend. Looking back today, I see that this journey was more than a wound. It was a turning point, a call to leave behind my role as a supporting character and return to being the protagonist of my own life. Because even though the pages of my diary may have told another version of the story, mine is still being written, and now, in my own words, in my own way. It's curious how something that seems like the end can actually be the gateway to a new beginning, a more conscious, more whole beginning, because when we look pain in the face, it stops controlling us. And then, yes, freedom begins. The life I lead today isn't perfect. There are still days when longing stings, when memories hurt, but they're becoming fewer and fewer. And what grows within me is the certainty that I don't need applause to know I'm strong. My strength lies in the story I had the courage to live, and even more so, in the one I decided to rewrite. So if you saw yourself in any part of this story, if any of my words resonated within you, know this: you are not alone. The pain may have come first, but healing is also on the way. And it begins, as it did for me, when we accept looking at the truth without fear, without haste, but with presence. Comment here. My story also has a new beginning. I want to know who else is rising from their own ruins and choosing to live with more truth, more awareness, more self-love. If you've come this far with me, with an open heart, I can only thank you. It's not easy to delve into these deep layers, to face memories, to reflect on pains we often don't even have the courage to name. But if this conversation touched you in some way, then it was worth it. If you want to continue receiving stories like this, lived, felt, and told with truth, subscribe here to the channel. This is the space that allows me to continue sharing every piece of this journey with you, just the way it is. And if you want to show me that you stayed with me until the end, leave it here in the comments. I'm with you until the end. I would love to know who has walked side by side with me so far. Oh, and if this conversation made you think, reflect, or feel welcomed, leave a like too, not only because it helps, but because that's how we build the bond that's already begun between us. There's a video here on the side that complements this subject, Click and continue with me there. There's still a lot we can talk about, calmly, in a way that only those who live it understand.